In 356 BC, in the ancient kingdom of Macedon, a prince was born who would eventually become one of the most famous figures in human history. That child was Alexander the Great. His birth came at a moment when Macedon was transforming from a regional kingdom into a rising military power, largely due to the ambitions and reforms of his father, Philip II of Macedon. Alexander entered a world where greatness was not merely encouraged, it was expected. Philip II had spent years strengthening Macedon through military innovation, political alliances, and conquest. He transformed the Macedonian army into one of the most effective fighting forces of the ancient world, introducing the famous phalanx formation armed with long sarissas. By the time Alexander was born, Philip was already laying the foundations for an empire. His mother, Olympias, was equally influential, though in a very different way. A princess from Epirus, Olympias was known for her strong personality, religious devotion, and fierce ambition for her son. Ancient sources often portray her as deeply involved in Alexander's upbringing, encouraging him to see himself as destined for extraordinary achievements. Almost immediately, legends began to surround Alexander's birth. Ancient writers recorded stories that blurred the line between history and mythology. Some claimed that Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt striking her womb before Alexander was born. Others suggested that she believed the god Zeus himself was Alexander's true father. These accounts cannot be verified as historical fact, but they reveal something important about how Alexander was viewed even during his lifetime. From an early age, many people saw him as a figure connected to destiny and divine favor. One story from his youth became especially famous. According to ancient accounts, a powerful horse named Bucephalus was brought before the royal court. The animal appeared uncontrollable. Experienced handlers failed to tame it, and Philip reportedly prepared to dismiss it as useless. But the young Alexander observed something others had missed. He noticed that the horse was frightened by its own shadow. Turning the animal toward the sun, he gradually calmed it and successfully mounted it. The story may have been embellished over time, but it became one of the defining symbols of Alexander's character. It suggested intelligence, confidence, and a willingness to attempt what others considered impossible. Ancient historians even recorded Philip's alleged reaction, that Macedon was too small for his son and that he should seek a greater kingdom for himself. Whether those exact words were spoken or not, they reflected a growing reality. Alexander was not being raised for an ordinary life. Surrounded by stories of heroes such as Achilles and inspired by the achievements of his father, he developed ambitions that stretched far beyond Macedon's borders. From the beginning, Alexander's life was framed by expectations of greatness. The legends, the education, the competition, and the pressure all pointed toward a future unlike that of any ordinary ruler. Yet an important question lingered beneath these early stories. Was Alexander truly destined for greatness from the moment of his birth? Or would the belief in destiny itself become the force that drove him to pursue greatness at any cost? As Alexander grew from a promising prince into the heir of Macedon, his father understood that military talent alone would not be enough. Philip II of Macedon had built his kingdom through strategy, diplomacy, and warfare, and he wanted his son to possess the knowledge required to rule something even greater. Around 343 BC, he entrusted Alexander's education to one of the most influential thinkers of the ancient world, Aristotle. The decision was extraordinary. Aristotle was not simply a teacher. He was already renowned for his work in philosophy, logic, ethics, politics, biology, and natural science. Under his guidance, Alexander received an education far broader than that of most princes. Lessons extended beyond military command into questions about government, human nature, morality, medicine, geography, and the structure of the natural world. The setting itself reflected the importance of this education. Aristotle taught Alexander and a select group of young Macedonian nobles at Mysa, a sanctuary surrounded by gardens and quiet groves. There, future generals and statesmen studied together, many of whom would later accompany Alexander on his campaigns across Asia. Through Aristotle, Alexander was introduced to the intellectual traditions of the Greek world. He learned to analyze arguments, understand political systems, and appreciate literature. He studied the achievements of earlier civilizations and became familiar with the cultures beyond Macedon's borders. These lessons helped shape a ruler who would later show interest in foreign customs, geography, and scientific exploration during his conquests. For Alexander, this ideal became increasingly powerful. The heroes of Greek tradition were remembered centuries after their deaths because of their extraordinary deeds. To a young prince raised among stories of divine destiny and heroic achievement, such examples offered a model for how a life should be lived. Greatness was not measured merely by survival, wealth, or comfort. It was measured by whether history remembered your name. This influence created an important tension within Alexander's education. Aristotle taught moderation, reason, and careful reflection. Philosophy encouraged understanding and self-control. Yet the heroic stories Alexander admired celebrated bold action, risk, and the relentless pursuit of honor. The same education that exposed him to wisdom also introduced him to ideals that could justify extraordinary ambition. In later years, this contradiction would become increasingly apparent. Alexander would lead armies farther than any Greek ruler before him, spreading culture, knowledge, and political influence across vast territories. At the same time, those achievements would come through years of warfare, destruction, and immense human cost. The lessons of Mysa gave Alexander knowledge, discipline, and intellectual curiosity, but they also reinforced his belief that a person could transcend ordinary limits and achieve immortality through achievement. The question that emerged from his education was one that would define the rest of his life. Can wisdom restrain ambition, or does it simply provide ambition with greater purpose and power? The future that Philip II of Macedon had spent decades building came to a sudden and violent halt in 336 BC. During a royal celebration at Aegae, the ancient capital of Macedon, Philip was assassinated by a member of his own bodyguard, Pausanias of Orestes. The exact motives behind the murder remain debated by historians. Ancient sources offered conflicting explanations, ranging from personal grievances to broader political conspiracies. What is certain is that the most powerful man in Greece was dead, and the kingdom he had forged suddenly faced uncertainty. For his 20-year-old son, Alexander the Great, the assassination was more than a personal tragedy. It was a test of survival. 4. The transition of power was anything but secure. In the ancient world, a king's death often invited rivals, rebels, and opportunists to challenge the succession. Although Alexander was Philip's designated heir, many doubted whether a young ruler could maintain control over the kingdom his father had built. Some Macedonian nobles had their own ambitions. Beyond Macedon, many Greek city-states saw Philip's death as an opportunity to regain their independence. Alexander understood the danger immediately. His first actions were swift and decisive. Potential rivals within Macedon were neutralized before they could organize opposition. The new king moved quickly to secure the loyalty of the army, knowing that military support was the foundation of his authority. Without hesitation, he demonstrated that the throne would not be contested. Yet the greater challenge lay beyond his borders. News of Philip's death spread rapidly across Greece. Several cities assumed that Macedonian dominance would collapse under inexperienced leadership. Rebellions began to emerge. Athens expressed hopes of restoring its influence. Other regions reconsidered their loyalty. Most dramatically, the powerful city of Thebes openly revolted against Macedonian rule. For many leaders, such a crisis might have required months of preparation. Alexander responded with remarkable speed. Marching south with his army, he covered distances that stunned his opponents. Thebes expected time to gather support from other Greek states. Instead, Alexander appeared before its walls before many even realized he was coming. The city refused to surrender. What followed became one of the most consequential events of Alexander's early reign. In 335 BC, Macedonian forces stormed Thebes. The city was defeated, and its destruction was carried out on a scale intended to send a message throughout Greece. Most of Thebes was razed. Thousands were killed or sold into slavery, while surviving structures associated with cultural and religious significance were largely spared. The consequences were immediate. Across Greece, resistance collapsed. Cities that had considered rebellion quickly submitted. The lesson was unmistakable. Philip II was dead, but Macedonian power was not. For Alexander, The destruction of Thebes marked a turning point. Until then, he had been viewed largely as Philip's son, a young heir inheriting another man's achievements. After Thebes, he emerged as a ruler in his own right. The campaign demonstrated qualities that would define the rest of his career: speed, decisiveness, strategic calculation, and a willingness to use overwhelming force when he believed it necessary. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander the Great stood at the edge of a campaign that many believed was impossible. Behind him lay the kingdom of Macedon and the Greek states his father had united. Ahead lay the vast territories of the Achaemenid Empire, the largest and wealthiest empire the ancient world had ever seen. For nearly 2 centuries, Persia had dominated the Near East. Its territory stretched from Egypt to Central Asia, encompassing dozens of peoples, languages, and cultures. Its kings commanded enormous resources and armies that dwarfed those of most rivals. To many observers, Persian power appeared permanent, yet Alexander intended to challenge it. 5. When he crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor, he did so with a force that was impressive by Greek standards, but remarkably small for the task ahead. Ancient sources suggest he brought roughly 30,000 to 40,000 infantry and around 5,000 cavalry. He also carried significant financial risk. The Macedonian treasury was not overflowing with wealth, and the campaign depended heavily on future victories to sustain itself. The invasion was not merely a military operation. It was presented as a continuation of the long conflict between Greece and Persia. Alexander portrayed himself as leading a campaign of liberation for Greek cities under Persian control. At the same time, his ambitions clearly extended far beyond limited objectives. Opposing him was Darius III, ruler of the Achaemenid Empire. Although Darius would not immediately face Alexander in person, he represented the authority and resources of a state that had survived for generations. The Persian system was supported by powerful regional governors known as satraps, experienced military leaders, and immense economic wealth. Few could imagine that such an empire could be seriously threatened by a 22-year-old king from the northern fringes of the Greek world. The first major test came at the Battle of the Granicus. Persian forces positioned themselves along the banks of the Granicus River in northwestern Asia Minor, expecting the river itself to hinder any Macedonian attack. Conventional military wisdom suggested caution. Crossing a river under enemy opposition was one of the most dangerous operations in ancient warfare. Alexander chose to attack anyway. Leading from the front, he personally participated in the assault. As Macedonian cavalry fought their way across the river, fierce combat erupted along the banks. Ancient accounts describe Alexander placing himself in extraordinary danger. At one point, he reportedly came close to being killed before being saved by one of his companions. The battle ended in a decisive Macedonian victory. Its significance extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Granicus opened the western regions of Asia Minor to Alexander's advance and shattered the belief that Persian forces were unbeatable. Greek cities began surrendering or welcoming him as liberator. Regional Persian authority weakened, while Macedonian confidence surged. More importantly, the victory reinforced Alexander's emerging reputation among his soldiers. Unlike many rulers who directed battles from relative safety, he consistently placed himself in the most dangerous parts of the battlefield. His men saw him sharing their risks and hardships. This leadership style created a powerful bond between commander and army. As victories accumulated across Asia Minor, a sense of momentum began to develop. What had initially seemed like a daring invasion started to look like the beginning of something far larger. Soldiers who had crossed into Asia expecting difficult campaigns now watched city after city fall before them. Among many of Alexander's followers, a belief began to take hold that he possessed an extraordinary destiny. Every victory seemed to confirm it. Every risk he survived strengthened it. Every obstacle overcome made the next challenge appear less impossible. The campaign was still in its early stages, and the greatest confrontations lay ahead. Darius III remained on his throne. The Persian Empire still possessed vast armies and immense resources. But for the first time, the ancient world witnessed something it had not expected, a challenger capable of shaking an empire that had long seemed eternal. Because every empire appears permanent, until someone proves that it is not. The victory at the Granicus had opened the gates of Asia Minor, but it had not yet defeated the Persian Empire. The true contest still lay ahead. Somewhere beyond the mountains and deserts of the east stood Darius III, ruler of the vast Achaemenid Empire, determined to stop the advance of Alexander the Great. In 333 BC, the two kings met for the first time at the Battle of Issus. Despite commanding a larger force, Darius found himself constrained by the narrow terrain near the coast of southern Anatolia. Alexander exploited the situation with characteristic speed and aggression. Leading his cavalry toward the Persian center, he launched a direct assault aimed at Darius himself. 4. The battle ended in another decisive Macedonian victory. Darius fled the field, leaving behind not only his army but also members of his own family, who were captured by Alexander. For the Persian king, it was a humiliating defeat. For Alexander, it was proof that he could challenge the greatest ruler of his age and win. Yet even after Issus, the war was not over. Alexander continued south along the eastern Mediterranean coast, securing key cities and ports. The long siege of Tyre demonstrated both his determination and his willingness to commit enormous resources to eliminate resistance. He then entered Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. There, he founded the city of Alexandria, which would later become one of the greatest centers of learning and culture in the ancient world. The decisive moment came in 331 BC at the Battle of Gaugamela. Unlike Issus, Gaugamela was fought on terrain carefully chosen by Darius. The Persian king assembled a massive army and prepared the battlefield to maximize its effectiveness. This was intended to be the battle that ended the Macedonian invasion once and for all. Instead, it ended the Persian Empire. Once again, Alexander's tactical flexibility and leadership proved decisive. While the exact size of the opposing forces remains debated, there is little doubt that the Persians significantly outnumbered the Macedonians. Yet Alexander identified weaknesses in the Persian deployment and drove directly toward the center. As pressure mounted, Darius fled for a second time. The consequences were enormous. The road to the heart of Persia now lay open. One by one, the empire's great capitals fell. Alexander entered Babylon, one of the richest and most famous cities in the world. He later occupied Susa and eventually reached Persepolis, the symbolic center of Achaemenid power. The wealth he encountered was almost unimaginable. Royal treasuries accumulated over generations fell into his hands. Gold, silver, precious artifacts, and vast resources that had once belonged to Persian kings now belonged to Alexander. At an age when many rulers were only beginning their reigns, he had become master of the largest empire the world had yet seen. But conquest brought a new challenge. As Alexander's power expanded, so did his vision. He no longer saw himself merely as a Macedonian king leading a Greek campaign against Persia. Increasingly, he began presenting himself as the legitimate successor to the Persian monarchs he had defeated. This shift was reflected in his behavior. Alexander adopted elements of Persian court ceremony, clothing, and administration. He retained many Persian officials in positions of authority and encouraged cooperation between Macedonian and Persian elites. From a practical perspective, these policies helped govern an enormous and culturally diverse empire. Many of his Macedonian followers, however, viewed these changes with suspicion. The soldiers who had crossed into Asia with him had expected victory and wealth. They had not expected their king to embrace aspects of the culture they had spent years fighting. To them, Alexander seemed increasingly distant from the traditions that had defined Macedonian identity. What he viewed as integration, some of his companions viewed as abandonment. Tensions slowly emerged between the conqueror and the men who had helped build his empire. The farther east he traveled, the more profound those tensions became. Alexander had begun the campaign as a liberator of Greek cities and an avenger of past Persian invasions. Now he ruled the very empire he had destroyed. The line between conqueror and monarch was becoming increasingly blurred. The victories at Issus and Gaugamela had made him master of the East, but they also transformed the nature of his mission. The young king who crossed into Asia seeking glory now faced a different challenge: how to govern a world he had conquered. And in that transformation lay a deeper question. When does a liberator cease to be a liberator and become something else entirely? A ruler responsible not for winning an empire, but for holding it together? After the fall of the Persian Empire, many expected Alexander the Great to stop. He had defeated Darius III, captured the great capitals of the East, and acquired wealth beyond the imagination of most ancient rulers. By any conventional standard, his campaign had already achieved extraordinary success. But Alexander was not interested in conventional limits. Instead of returning west to consolidate his empire, he pushed deeper into the territories of Central Asia. What followed became some of the most difficult years of his military career. Unlike the decisive battles that had broken Persian power, these campaigns involved constant movement through vast and hostile landscapes. The enemy was no longer a centralized empire with major cities and royal armies. Instead, Alexander faced local rulers, tribal confederations, and guerrilla resistance spread across enormous distances. 5. The regions of Bactria and Sogdiana, located in parts of modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, presented challenges unlike anything his army had encountered before. Harsh deserts stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Rugged mountain ranges limited movement and communication. Resistance fighters could disappear into terrain unfamiliar to Macedonian forces, making decisive victories difficult to achieve. For years, Alexander and his army marched through these unforgiving environments. Fortresses had to be captured one by one. Rebellions repeatedly emerged after being suppressed. Campaigns that were expected to last months stretched into years. During this period, Alexander's life also took a significant personal turn. In 327 BC, he married Roxana, the daughter of a local nobleman. Ancient sources differ on the exact circumstances of the marriage, but it served both personal and political purposes. It strengthened ties with regional elites and symbolized Alexander's broader policy of integrating Macedonian and Eastern populations within his empire. Yet beneath these political successes, signs of strain were becoming increasingly visible. Years of campaigning had transformed Alexander's world. Many of the companions who had grown up alongside him now struggled to recognize the man he had become. The young king, educated by Aristotle and inspired by heroic ideals, was now the ruler of an empire stretching across continents. The responsibilities were immense, but so were the pressures. Ancient accounts suggest that Alexander became increasingly suspicious of potential threats. Whether these fears were justified or exaggerated by later historians remains debated, but several incidents reveal growing tensions within his inner circle. One of the most tragic involved Philotas, a trusted officer accused of conspiracy. After his execution, Alexander ordered the death of Philotas's father, Parmenion, one of the most experienced commanders who had served both Alexander and Philip II. The decision shocked many within the army. Parmenion had been a loyal supporter of the Macedonian cause for decades. Another infamous incident occurred during a banquet when Alexander killed Clitus the Black in a drunken argument. Clitus was not merely a subordinate. Years earlier, he had saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus. The killing deeply disturbed Alexander, who reportedly expressed intense remorse afterward. These episodes revealed a growing divide between the king and many of his longtime companions. The pressures of constant warfare, political responsibility, and imperial rule appeared to be taking a toll. Alexander remained a brilliant commander, but he was also becoming increasingly isolated. The irony was striking. With every conquest, his power grew larger. With every victory, his fame spread farther across the known world. Yet the circle of people he could fully trust seemed to shrink. The campaigns of Central Asia demonstrated Alexander's extraordinary determination. They also exposed the personal cost of relentless ambition. He had reached heights few rulers could imagine, but those heights came with distance, from old friendships, familiar traditions, and the companions who had once shared his journey. By this stage of his life, Alexander ruled more territory than any king before him. Yet the higher he climbed, the fewer people remained beside him. And in that reality lay one of history's enduring lessons. Power can bring admiration, fear, and obedience, but it often carries a loneliness that grows with every success. By 327 BC, Alexander the Great had already achieved what many considered impossible. The Achaemenid Empire had fallen. From Greece to Central Asia, vast territories now acknowledged his authority. Yet Alexander remained unwilling to stop. Beyond the eastern frontiers of his empire lay lands that were largely unknown to the Greeks, regions of immense rivers, powerful kingdoms, and ancient civilizations. For Alexander, the edge of the known world was not a boundary. It was an invitation. 5. His army crossed the Hindu Kush and advanced into the northwestern regions of the Indian subcontinent. The campaign immediately presented new challenges. The geography was unlike anything the Macedonians had previously encountered. Vast rivers cut across the landscape. Seasonal monsoon rains transformed roads into mud and complicated military operations. The climate was unfamiliar, and local resistance remained persistent. Among the rulers Alexander encountered was Porus, a powerful king who controlled territory near the Hydaspes River, known today as the Jhelum River. Unlike some rulers who chose submission or negotiation, Porus prepared for battle. In 326 BC, the two armies met at the Battle of the Hydaspes. It would become one of the most difficult engagements of Alexander's career. Porus possessed a force that included war elephants, animals rarely encountered by Macedonian troops. These massive creatures introduced a new dimension to the battlefield, capable of disrupting formations and creating chaos among soldiers and horses alike. Combined with challenging terrain and difficult weather conditions, they transformed the battle into a brutal test of endurance. Alexander ultimately secured victory through tactical maneuvering and disciplined coordination. Yet the cost was significant. Unlike earlier battles that had ended with overwhelming Macedonian superiority, Hydaspes demonstrated that Alexander's army could still be pushed to its limits. The aftermath revealed something equally important. Impressed by Porus's courage and leadership, Alexander allowed him to remain a ruler under Macedonian authority. This decision reflected a growing pattern in Alexander's approach to governance. He increasingly preferred incorporating capable local leaders into his empire rather than simply replacing them. But while Alexander continued looking eastward, his soldiers saw things differently. For years they had marched across continents. They had crossed deserts, climbed mountains, fought countless battles, and traveled farther from home than any Greek army in history. Many had left Macedon nearly a decade earlier. They had acquired wealth and glory, but they had also endured unimaginable hardship. When Alexander proposed advancing deeper into India, he encountered something he had rarely faced before: open resistance from his own army. At the Hyphasis River, known today as the Bios River, the troops refused to go farther. Reports of even larger kingdoms and armies beyond the river spread through the camp. Exhaustion had accumulated over years of continuous warfare. The soldiers wanted to return home. Alexander attempted to persuade them. He appealed to their pride, their achievements, and the possibility of even greater conquests ahead. Yet this time, his charisma and reputation were not enough. The army stood firm. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Alexander encountered a limit he could not overcome through courage, strategy, or determination. He could defeat kings. He could destroy empires. He could cross mountains and deserts. But he could not erase the exhaustion of thousands of men who had followed him to the edge of the known world. Reluctantly, he agreed to turn back. The moment carried profound significance. Throughout his career, Alexander had seemed unstoppable. Every obstacle had eventually yielded before his ambition. Yet at the Hyphasis, the barrier was not an enemy army or a fortified city. It was human endurance itself. The campaign into India revealed both the height of Alexander's achievements and the limits of even extraordinary leadership. His soldiers still admired him, but admiration could not replace rest. Loyalty could not erase fatigue. In the end, the king who had conquered nations discovered a truth that applied to every empire and every legend. No matter how powerful a leader becomes, there are some forces that cannot be commanded. Even the greatest conqueror in history could not conquer exhaustion. And there, at the edge of the world he had spent his life chasing, Alexander finally met resistance that victory alone could not overcome. The decision to turn back from India marked a turning point in the life of Alexander the Great. For nearly a decade, his campaigns had been defined by constant expansion. Every year had brought new victories, new territories, and new horizons. But now, for the first time, his advance had been halted, not by an enemy, but by the limits of his own army. The journey west would prove almost as devastating as many of the battles that had come before it. 4. After moving south through parts of the Indian subcontinent, Alexander chose a route that would become infamous in military history: the crossing of the Gadrosian Desert. Historians continue to debate his reasons. Some suggest he wished to emulate legendary conquerors who had attempted similar journeys. Others believe he wanted to test his army's endurance or demonstrate that no terrain could defeat him. Whatever his motivation, the results were catastrophic. The desert offered little water, limited food, and relentless heat. Supply lines struggled to keep pace with the army's movement. Men and animals died from thirst, exhaustion, and exposure. Ancient sources often emphasize the immense suffering endured during the march. Although exact casualty figures remain uncertain, there is little doubt that the crossing inflicted severe losses on an army that had already spent years campaigning far from home. The tragedy of Gadrosia stood in sharp contrast to Alexander's earlier triumphs. Victories at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela had expanded his empire. The desert achieved nothing comparable. It became a symbol of the growing gap between Alexander's ambitions and the practical realities faced by his followers. Yet even after such hardship, Alexander's vision continued to expand. By this stage, he was no longer thinking like a Macedonian king ruling conquered territories. Increasingly, he appeared to see himself as the architect of a new world order. Throughout the empire, he encouraged cooperation between different peoples and cultures. Persian nobles were incorporated into administration and military service. Mass marriages between Macedonians and Persians were promoted as a means of unifying elites from across the empire. To Alexander, these policies may have represented the foundation of a truly integrated empire stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. It was a vision unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. But many of his Macedonian followers viewed these changes differently. The soldiers who had followed him from Europe often felt increasingly disconnected from the king they once knew. They saw Persian customs gaining prominence at court. They witnessed foreign officials rising in influence. Some feared that Macedonian traditions were being replaced by a new imperial identity that no longer placed them at the center. The distance between Alexander and his army was no longer measured in geography. It was measured in outlook. At the same time, ancient writers began describing an Alexander whose ambitions seemed to grow with every success. Whether these accounts fully reflect reality is impossible to determine, but they reveal a perception shared by many contemporaries, that the king's goals were becoming increasingly vast and difficult to define. He had conquered the greatest empire of his age. He had marched farther than any Greek ruler before him. Yet he continued searching for something beyond simple victory. The question that emerged during these final campaigns was one that historians still debate. Was Alexander constructing a lasting empire based on integration and shared rule? Or had his ambitions expanded beyond what any empire, army, or human life could realistically sustain? As the army struggled westward through deserts and uncertainty, the dream that had carried them across continents began to show its first visible cracks. For the first time, it was no longer clear whether Alexander was building the future or chasing the impossible. In 323 BC, after years of relentless campaigning across 3 continents, Alexander the Great returned to one of the greatest cities of his empire, Babylon. Situated at the crossroads of the ancient world, Babylon had become a fitting center for the vast realm he had created. From Greece and Egypt to Persia and Central Asia, territories separated by thousands of kilometers now acknowledged his authority. At just 32 years old, Alexander stood at the height of his power. 5. Despite everything he had already achieved, there is little evidence that Alexander intended to stop. Ancient sources describe preparations for new military and naval projects. Plans were reportedly being discussed for campaigns into Arabia, expansion of trade networks, and further integration of the empire's distant provinces. Some later writers even suggested that Alexander envisioned additional conquests beyond Arabia, though the reliability of these claims remains uncertain. What is clear is that his ambitions remained active. The empire was not being wound down. It was still evolving. Then, suddenly, everything changed. In early June 323 BC, Alexander fell ill. The exact sequence of events varies slightly among ancient accounts. but most agree that he developed a severe fever that worsened over several days. At first, the illness did not appear extraordinary. Alexander had survived countless hardships throughout his life. He had endured wounds in battle, harsh climates, exhausting marches, and years of physical strain. Few would have imagined that a sickness could succeed where armies had failed. Yet his condition steadily deteriorated. As the days passed, he became increasingly weak. Eventually, he lost the ability to speak clearly and command directly. His generals and companions gathered around him, aware that the ruler who had transformed the ancient world was slipping beyond their reach. Ancient accounts describe a final scene in which soldiers were allowed to pass by his bed to see their king one last time. Whether every detail of these narratives is accurate is impossible to know, but they reflect the shock felt throughout the empire. Alexander had always appeared larger than life, a figure whose momentum seemed unstoppable. Now he lay helpless before an enemy no sword could defeat. The cause of his death remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Over the centuries, countless explanations have been proposed. Some ancient writers suspected poisoning, though most modern historians view this theory with skepticism due to the nature and duration of his illness. Others suggest infectious diseases such as malaria, typhoid fever, or other illnesses common in the region. Some researchers have argued that years of wounds, exhaustion, stress, and heavy physical demands may have weakened his body, making him more vulnerable to disease. No definitive answer exists. What remains undeniable is the outcome. On either June 10 or 11, 323 BC, Alexander died in Babylon. The consequences were immediate and profound. He left behind the largest empire the world had yet seen, but no clear adult successor capable of ruling it. The question that had never been fully addressed during his life now became urgent. Who would inherit Alexander's world? Yet beyond the political crisis lies the deeper significance of his death. For more than a decade, Alexander had outrun rivals, defeated kings, crossed deserts, scaled mountains, and conquered empires. Again and again, he had overcome obstacles that others considered impossible. His story seemed to challenge the limits that constrained ordinary rulers. But in Babylon, a reality emerged that no achievement could escape. The man who had outrun every enemy, conquered every battlefield, and pursued the edge of the known world discovered what every human being eventually discovers. No one outruns mortality. Not even Alexander the Great. The death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC ended one of history's most extraordinary lives, but it did not end the consequences of his achievements. In many ways, the most important chapter of his story began after he was gone. Alexander left behind an empire stretching from Greece to the borders of India, yet he left no clear successor capable of controlling it. His son, Alexander IV, had not yet been born at the time of his death, and his half-brother, Philip III Aridius, lacked the authority to unite such a vast realm. The result was a struggle for power among Alexander's leading commanders. 4. These generals, known to history as the Diadochi, spent decades fighting one another for control of Alexander's legacy. Figures such as Ptolemy I Soter, Seleucus I Nicator, and Antigonus I Monophthalmus transformed the empire into competing kingdoms. By the early 3rd century BC, Alexander's unified state had effectively disappeared. In that sense, his empire failed to survive him. Yet judging Alexander solely by the political collapse of his empire misses the larger historical picture. Although the empire fragmented, the world he created endured. Greek language, art, architecture, philosophy, and political ideas spread across vast regions of the Near East. New cities founded by Alexander and his successors became centers of trade, scholarship, and cultural exchange. The most famous of these, Alexandria, developed into one of the greatest intellectual centers of the ancient world. The death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC ended one of history's most extraordinary lives, but it did not end the consequences of his achievements. In many ways, the most important chapter of his story began after he was gone. This period became known as the Hellenistic Age, a civilization shaped by the blending of Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and other cultural traditions. Ideas traveled farther than ever before. Trade networks expanded. Scientific and philosophical developments flourished. The effects of Alexander's conquests influenced the Mediterranean and Near East for centuries, eventually shaping the worlds inherited by both Rome and later civilizations. His influence extended beyond culture. Military commanders studied his campaigns for generations. Statesmen examined his leadership. Historians debated his motives. Few individuals have left such a profound mark on warfare, politics, and the imagination of future generations. That is why Alexander remains one of history's most fascinating figures. He was a conqueror, but also a builder, a visionary, but also a destroyer. He united peoples and kingdoms, yet his campaigns brought immense suffering and loss. His legacy resists simple judgment because it contains both extraordinary achievement and undeniable cost. More than 2,000 years later, the question remains unresolved. Alexander never conquered the entire world. The dream that drove him eastward was left unfinished. His empire fractured, and many of his ambitions died with him in Babylon. And yet, the world that existed after Alexander was fundamentally different from the one that existed before him. Perhaps that is the paradox at the heart of his story. Did Alexander fail because he never conquered the world? Or did he succeed because he changed it forever?